This is Be Daring Lesson 8. First thing I'll mention before I forget is this week's classical picture is St. Paul by Pompeo Girolamo Battoni, 18th century painter. And I just love the way the light hits. It really shows dramatically just Paul and his greatness there. Well, as usual, I'll start with last week. And last week, Paul we were on his third trip, and we were going through it. This was I think our second lesson on his third trip, and he traveled through Macedonia, Greece, and went there. He'd been there before, but he went this third time to encourage the disciples to keep the faith and keep going strong. While he was at Troas, it was kind of his farewell big speech, and Eutychus, the little fellow, fell out the window, and he revived him from death. And then he moved on and said goodbye to the Ephesian elders. He'd spent 2 years in Ephesus, and so he was going back through again. That was a long third journey. 2 years in Ephesus. Well, he went there. He didn't go to Ephesus. He stopped at Miletus, which was a port that he had to stop at anyway. It was pretty close. So the elders came down. They had a big farewell meeting and meal, and he encouraged them to keep the faith, and they encouraged him. This week's scripture narrates how the Jews falsely accused Paul. Believe it or not, they falsely accused him again, this time in Jerusalem, and it led to a riot and his arrest. Paul addressed the crowd. This riot, he tried to, and he was doing okay till he described, as we'll see, how his God told him his mission needed to move on to the Gentiles. That's what they were writing about in the first place. So they just that fomented the anger even more, and led the Romans to detain him for his protection and his own protection and questioning. You'll see that Romans were confused. What's going on here? So they thought they'd ask him. Well, anyway, it's an exciting chapter. In it, we're going to see 3 confrontations that Paul experienced. That's how Wiersbe breaks this down. The Jewish council, Jesus, and the Jewish conspirators. Excuse me, folks. What?
Bless you.
Well, thank you. I don't know what's going on. Let's begin with Acts 22, verse 30, and we'll go through 23, verse 10.
The next day, the commander ordered the leading priests into session with the Jewish high council. He wanted to find out what the trouble was about, so he released Paul to have him stand before them. Gazing intently at the high council, Paul began, "Brothers, I have always lived before God with a clear conscience." Instantly, Ananias, the high priest, commanded those close to Paul to slap him on the mouth. But Paul said to him, "Good, God will slap you, you corrupt hypocrite. What kind of judge are you to break the law yourself by ordering me struck like that?" Those standing near Paul said to him, Do you dare to insult God's high priest?" "I'm sorry, brothers, I didn't realize he was a high priest." Paul replied, "For the scriptures say you must not speak evil of any of your rulers." Paul realized that some members of the high council were Sadducees and some were Pharisees. So he shouted, "Brothers, I'm a Pharisee, as were my ancestors. and I am on trial because my hope is in the resurrection of the dead." This divided the council, the Pharisees against the Sadducees. For the Sadducees said there is no resurrection or angels or spirits, but the Pharisees believe in all of these things. So there was a great uproar. Some of the teachers of religious law who were Pharisees jumped up and began to argue forcefully. "We see nothing wrong with him," they shouted. "Perhaps a spirit or an angel spoke to him." As the conflict grew more violent, the commander was afraid they would tear Paul apart. So he ordered his soldiers to go and rescue him by force and take him back to the fortress.
Okay, thank you, Ida, for reading that. Try to get my voice back here. Upon learning of this Paul's Roman citizenship, suddenly this captain found himself in kind of a bad situation. He had to ensure Paul was aware of the formal accusations against him, because that's a right that every Roman citizen has. So if this soldier doesn't do that, then he's in trouble himself. And despite his notoriety, Paul's notoriety, evidenced by all the people who were against him, he couldn't find anything explicitly wrong. What law has he violated? They didn't know what to do about him. And then the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin, this is the same body, the same group of characters who had Jesus crucified. So these are the guys who are now got Paul in front of them, and they're esteemed scholars. And they're led by the high priest, and their role was supposed to be to enforce the sacred Jewish laws and resolve the legal breaches. And then Rome's authorization did extend to a capital punishment for the more grave transgressions in the Jewish law. So this states this was in effect Paul's defense before this body was really a defense for his life. And during the hearing, as Ida said, the captain and his men ended up escorting Paul into the council chambers and then observed from the sidelines. They were cautious. Why were they cautious? Because previous temple confrontations involving Paul had led to riots. So Claudius stood watch, this guy Claudius, understanding that his failure to do the right thing here to help the prisoner, since he was a citizen of Rome, could lead to his own death. And especially if the charges were vague and trumped up like these were. So we have the defense. Well, Paul opens his defense to the council with familiar terms, signifying his Jewish identity. He said, "Hey, I'm like you." It's used of live, translated as lived as a citizen, suggests that a lawful life underpinned by uncondemning conscience, reflected in Paul's repeated emphasis on the conscious, it reflected how Paul repeatedly used the idea of conscience throughout his words and acts and the epistles. Conscience does not make the standards. Our conscience does not make standards. It relies upon our personal standards, our personal values, whether they're right or wrong. And it becomes unreliable when we repeatedly compromise those. So criminals, gangsters have a conscience. It's just not a really good one. It's based on bad standards. They may feel guilty for not breaking a law. Who knows? Anyway, that's so the point there is you can't really rely on your conscience because you need a more absolute standard. And the law of God is the ultimate standard, and that's what Paul suggests he use. Paul, a pure conscience follows a divine guidance, contrasting with a defiled one, which dims your moral perceptions. Despite his earlier persecutions of Christians himself, Paul maintained a clean conscience. Well, how do you do that? By acting according to his understanding, which he revised significantly upon converting to Christianity. After becoming a Christian, the bright light of God's glory shone into his heart. 2 Corinthians 4:6 elaborates that. For God, who said, "Let there be light in the darkness," has made this light shine in our hearts so that we could know the glory of God that is seen in the face of Jesus Christ. Well, at Paul's assertion of this clear conscience, Ananias, this guy now, notorious for corruption and violence, he reacts illegally and violently once more. And in response, what did Paul do? He condemns Ananias's actions, casting him as a hypocrite, which is an accusation that God confirmed when rebellion which God confirmed when during a rebellion later, Wiersbe adds this thing on, Ananias did die at the hands of Jewish insurrectionists when they revolted against Rome in AD 66. So in 23:5, he said, let's see. Oh, that's true. To 23:5, what Ida read. I'm sorry, brothers, I didn't realize he was the high priest. Okay. We don't know whether that was, he was employing sarcasm or he was sincerely sorry and didn't really know it was the Ananias, the high priest. Well, either way, it's clear that Paul respected the office. He might not have respected the person, Ananias, but he respected the office of high priest, and he distinguished that. Well, having his personal appeal there rejected, Paul shifted to kind of a different tactic, which was a doctrinal argument centered on the resurrection, because he knew that would stir up the Pharisees against the Sadducees, and the Sadducees would be upset. The Pharisees would say he's right, and that's exactly what happened there. Some may wonder whether he was doing this, just as politically motivated rather than what he really felt, but it could be. But he did realize that he was not going to get a fair trial from this Sanhedrin. It was just a what do you call it, a kangaroo court. It was not gonna, they were just pushing through fast as they could to get him convicted. So instead he could see the end, and he decided to change that end by, he said, let me get the Pharisees and Sadducees, against each other, and then the Romans will do what they did. They swooped in and took him out of that situation, because the Romans said, what the heck, who's right, the Pharisees or the Sadducees? That's a religious topic. Let's get this guy out and figure out what he did wrong. not get into a religious debate. In the process, Paul underscored the fundamental doctrine of resurrection. That was central to the theological discourse of Paul's entire evangelism, and it recurs across the Acts narrative, we'll see. His testimony here before the Sanhedrin added to a series of significant apostolic trials, yet the council's refusal echoed throughout their history too. They'd refused, they didn't believe Jesus, and so it's not surprising they're not believing Paul. And so what did they do in the end? He ordered he ordered the soldiers to go and rescue him by force and take him back to the fortress. So now he's back in the fortress. Let's see what happens there.
That night, the Lord appeared to Paul and said, "Be encouraged, Paul. Just as you have been a witness to me here in Jerusalem, you must preach the good news in Rome as well."
Wow. So after Paul's conversion, Jesus appeared to him multiple times to guide and encourage him. And this is one of them. Once Paul's life was in danger in Jerusalem here, Jesus appears in the temple and instructed him. Sorry, that was earlier. That was in Acts 22. Later in Corinth, when Paul felt discouraged, Jesus appeared, encouraged him to stay, continue his work. Now, at this particularly low point in the ministry, Jesus appeared again to uplift and instruct him like he just did. This assurance of Jesus' constant presence comforts all believers. Back in Matthew 28:20, Jesus says, "Teach these new disciples to obey all the commands I have given you, and be sure of this, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." That was the Great Commission. Jesus' message to Paul was one of courage. It says, "Be of cheer, take courage." These are words Jesus often spoke during his ministry. He used them to the paralyzed man, a woman suffering from a hemorrhage, disciples during the storm, in the upper room before his crucifixion. This encouragement reminds us that in tough times, we can always take courage because, the Lord's with us. Jesus commended Paul. He didn't rebuke him. Note that here Paul goes into Jerusalem and they've been warning him, "Paul, don't go there, don't go there." Yeah, for good. But they didn't rebuke him. But praised him, his witness there, even though the Jews there rejected it. Despite the apparent failure of Paul's actions in Jerusalem, causing a riot and leaving the Sanhedrin in confusion, that doesn't sound like a successful day of an apostle to me. Yeah, caused a riot, left the Sanhedrin in disarray, ended up in a fortress of the Romans. The Lord Jesus was pleased with his testimony. This approval of the Lord's what really matters. You did what I needed you to do, Paul. Finally, then, Jesus gave Paul a message of confidence. He assured him, "Paul, you're going to get to go to Rome. Maybe like you think you planned on it, but you're going to get to go to Rome." Although the events in Jerusalem seemed to threaten this goal, the promise from Jesus gave Paul great encouragement during it's going to really help in the coming weeks of trials, false accusations, assassination attempts, and just kind of being put on the back burner and ignored for a while in prison. Through it all, Paul trusted that the Lord was with him, fulfilling his plan to bring that apostle to Rome. like you, but he's not through with his problems right now. Here he is in that fortress, currently protected. However, see what happens next.
The next morning, excuse me. The next morning, a group of Jews got together and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 of them in the conspiracy. They went to the leading priests and elders and told them, "We have bound ourselves with an oath to eat nothing until we have killed Paul. So you and the high council should ask the commander to bring Paul back to the council again. Pretend you want to examine his case more fully. We will kill him on the way." But Paul's nephew, his sister's son, heard of their plan and went to the fortress and told Paul. Paul called for one of the Roman officers and said, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something important to tell him." So the officer did, explaining, "Paul, the prisoner, called me over and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you." The commander took his hand, led him aside, and asked, "What is it you want to tell me?" Paul's nephew told him, "Some Jews are going to ask you to bring Paul before the high council tomorrow, pretending they want to get some more information. But don't do it. There are more than 40 men hiding along the way, ready to ambush him. They have vowed not to eat or drink anything until they have killed him. They are ready now, just waiting for your consent. Don't let anyone know you told me this," the commander warned the young man. Then the commander called 2 of his officers and ordered, "Get 200 soldiers ready to leave for Caesarea at 9 o'clock tonight. Also take 200 spearmen and 70 mounted troops. Provide horses for Paul to ride and get him safely to Governor Felix." Then he wrote this letter to the governor. "From Claudius Lysias to His Excellency Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by some Jews, and they were about to kill him when I arrived with the troops. When I learned that he was a Roman citizen, I removed him to safety. Then I took him to their high council to try to learn the basis of the accusations against him. I soon discovered the charge was something regarding their religious law, certainly nothing worthy of imprisonment or death. But when I was informed of a plot to kill him, I immediately sent him on to you. I have told his accusers to bring their charges before you." So that night, as ordered, the soldiers took Paul as far as Antipatris. They returned to the fortress the next morning, while the mounted troops took him on to Caesarea. When they arrived in Caesarea, they presented Paul and the letter to Governor Felix. He read it and then asked Paul what province he was from. "Cilicia," Paul answered. "I will hear your case myself when your accusers arrive," the governor told him. Then the governor ordered him kept in prison at Herod's headquarters.
Okay, a lot of verses. Thank you. Well, Paul's life had been in danger from the beginning of his ministry, as we know, and when he witnessed for Christ in Damascus that very first time, they thought he was trying to get in there to kill him. During his first visit to Jerusalem after his conversion, the Hellenistic Jews tried to kill him because he'd been trying to kill them. The Jews then drove him out of Antioch in Pisidia, if you recall, threatened to stone him in Iconium. Then they did stone him in Lystra. He gets down to Corinth, and they tried to get him arrested. And then in Ephesus, the Jews had a plot to kill him, and they even planned to kill him at sea. Paul's words in 1 Thessalonians 2:14-16 take on special meaning when that you consider all that Paul suffered at the hands of his countrymen. Let's read the First Thessalonians 2:14-16. And then, dear brothers and sisters, you suffered persecution from your own countrymen. In this way, you imitated the believers in the churches, God's churches in Judea, who, because of their belief in Jesus Christ, suffered from their own people, the Jews. For some of the Jews killed the prophets, and some even killed the Lord Jesus. Now they have persecuted us too. They fail to please God and work against all humanity. And they try to keep us from preaching the good news of salvation to the Gentiles. By doing this, they continue to pile up their sins, but the anger of God has caught up with them at last. Perhaps it's this time it was the Asian Jews, not from like China or anything. It means from the province of Asia, which was up there where Paul was, just north of Israel. And they conspired, maybe this time it was them, maybe they conspired. Some of the chief priests and the elders agreed to cooperate with them and tried to influence Claudius, just getting killed. It was natural for this council to want to further information from Paul, and it would have been easy to ambush Paul's third party and kill the apostle, get a little more information from him and then kill him. If this got the captain in trouble with his superiors, right, he figures the high priest could probably keep him out of too much trouble. And it's just one man, Paul, against Claudius, and he had the support of the high priest, and his superiors probably would probably look the other way. Anyway, the Romans and the Jews had cooperated this way before. Matthew 28, they did it with Jesus. But the 40 fasting men and scheming religious leaders had forgotten that Paul was an apostle of Jesus Christ, and that the exalted Lord was watching from heaven. At Paul's conversion, the Lord had told him that he would suffer. And when he fell off that horse, got off that horse, and was looking up at the Lord, Lord said, "You're going to suffer, Paul," but he promised to deliver him from his enemies at the same time there. Paul held on to that promise all his life, and God was faithful to it. We know nothing about, moving on to this fellow that had the news, the nephew. We don't know about Paul's sister and nephew, except what's recorded here. You can get a hint from Philippians 3:8 that Paul lost his family when he became a Christian. They rejected him, but we don't know if his relatives maybe later converted. The word kinsman in Romans 16:7-11 means fellow Jew, as in Romans 3. So he uses the word my fellow kinsman in Romans a few times. Like here's this great Andronicus and Junia, my fellow Jews who were in prison with me. These are highly respected, he called them kinsmen, compatriots or kinsmen. So he uses a similar phrase there. Anyway, since Paul's family had long been connected, though, with the Pharisees, otherwise Paul was not going to have been able to study at the feet of Gamaliel. They had to be connected with the Pharisees. His sister may have been in touch with the powers that be and able to pick up, from the rumor mill. And they say a secret is something you tell one person at a time. Now, Paul's sister, nephew, they were probably devout Jews and knew that this plot was evil. So they knew this wasn't right. They had to do something to help his uncle and brother. It was in the providence of God they were able to hear that news and convey it privately to Claudius. St. Augustine said, Trust in the past. You know what? Let me try you. Trust the past to the mercy of God, the present to his love, and the future to his providence. Well, that was God's providence there. We can admire the integrity and the courage of Claudius, this Roman. Despite the trouble Paul had already caused him, Claudius trusted that boy's warning about the plot. He could have ignored it or used this information for his own gain. I mean, gotten some money to out of the thing, but he acted honorably. Excuse me. In fact, if you look throughout Acts, I didn't realize this till Wearsby pointed it out. Luke speaks favorably of Roman military officers throughout, from Cornelius in Acts 10 to Julius in Acts 27. He portrays the Roman officers, the military, as respectable and law-abiding. There's no record of Roman officers persecuting Christians in Acts. The opposition came from the unbelieving Jews mainly, and the officials who were corrupt. There were political opportunists and in the government of Rome, like Festus and some others, but the military leaders generally upheld the law. Claudius had a simple, wise plan. He needed to get Paul out of Jerusalem to prevent continuous murder plots. Additionally, he needed to determine the charges against Paul to prevent his superiors from accusing him of the officer, this Claudius, of illegally holding the Roman citizen, because then he'd be in trouble. So what do I do with this guy? If I let him go, they'll kill him. And then I'll be in trouble. If I keep him, then I'll be in trouble for keeping him. So he sent him to Caesarea, the governor Felix, so that he could solve the problem. Paul would have been an easy target, on that trip if he traveled alone. So God arranged through this Claudius to send 470 Roman soldiers to protect him. And they smuggled Paul. I don't imagine it was much of a smuggle if they're 470, but it was at night, just as his friends had done in other cities. So by cover of night, he'd escaped in a lot of situations. Claudius's official letter that he wrote is interesting. He portrayed himself as a man and his men positively. He mentions the good stuff they did, and doesn't mention the bad stuff. He claimed they saved Paul because he was a Roman. However, initially Claudius thought Paul was an Egyptian and almost had him scourged. You remember Acts 23:29 supports the idea that Roman officers do not consider Christians to be criminals. Back at that verse. I soon discovered the charge was something regarding their religious law, certainly not worthy of imprisonment or death. This follows the similar sentiments from the officials in Philippi, Corinth, and Ephesus, and later from Festus and Herod Agrippa. So they just everywhere Paul went, the Romans felt that same way. It's like it's some weird religious thing that we don't understand, and I'm no expert on this, so I don't think he's broken any Roman laws. Well, anyway, Paul and his escort left Jerusalem at 9 o'clock that night, marching 37 miles to Antipatris by the morning. The cavalry continued with Paul to Caesarea, while the soldiers returned back to their barracks, traveled another 27 miles to Caesarea, where Paul was headed over to Felix. So he got some good steps in that day. He walked a long distance. Paul was safe from the Jewish plotters now, but his safety from Felix was a different situation. Antonius Felix was governor or procurator of Judea. He had married Drusilla, who was a Jewish woman who was the daughter of Herod Agrippa I and had left her husband to become Felix's third wife. Yeah, okay. She was also the sister to Herod Agrippa II. So these Herods and Felix are all intermixed together here. Now Tacitus, who's a Roman historian, he described Felix as someone who exercised power, the power of a king with the spirit of a slave. He was known as a vulgar ruffian. So that's who he's dealing with now. So this royal escort, 470 soldiers there protected Paul and placed him in the palace built by Herod the Great. He was the guy when Jesus was born, while the governor had his official residence, that's where he governs. This governor Felix, well, he was going to stay in the palace of Herod the Great. It's possible that some of the believers in Caesarea were aware of Paul's presence and might have offered him support and encouragement while he was there, especially recalling Agabus' prophecy back at the beginning, that he was going to get bound and tied, and that he was bad things were going to happen in Jerusalem. Well, Paul's unwavering commitment to his calling stands out in this chapter. That's one thing that he never wavered. He declared, "None of these things move me." In Acts 20:24, Paul was determined to follow Christ regardless of the consequences. He sought not the easiest path, but the one that would most honor God and reach the lost, even if it meant becoming a prisoner for the gospel's sake. So here he is, a prisoner because of God, because he fought following God, rather. Meanwhile, God's providence in caring for Paul is also clear in this chapter. So you got Paul's determination, Paul's dedication to the Lord is clear in this chapter. And then God's care, God's taking care of Paul is also evident. In Psalm 37, verse 7, it says, "The angel of the Lord is a guard. He surrounds and defends all who fear him." Knowing their Savior is dependable, we, God's people, can be daring and following his will. And that's what Paul did. He was all by himself, but he was not truly by himself because he had the Lord with him, and therefore he didn't have anything to fear in his mind. So in summary, in this lesson, we learned how the Jews falsely accused Paul in Jerusalem, led to a violent riot and his arrest, and Paul attempted to address that crowd. He was doing okay till he described his mission to the Gentiles, and that just stirred when he did that, he blew on the embers and made them even angrier, and led the Romans to detain him for his protection and questioning there. So now the Romans have him, and eventually he winds up in front of this guy Festus. And in the process to get to Festus, he goes through 3 confrontations, first with the Jewish council, then with Jesus, and this with the Jewish conspirators who had sworn to kill him. Next week, we're going to study the rest of Acts 22, and then get into Acts 23 up to verse 35. And in that scripture, Paul's going to face another trial before the Sanhedrin, He's going to leverage his Roman citizenship to avoid discouraging, and then it's going to highlight God's providential protection and Paul's unwavering faith opposed in the face of opposition. Actually, I think that was a description of this week. I think I mixed that up, to be honest. Next week, it's going to be before Festus and the things that happen after that. It's going to be a waiting game because Festus is going to just keep him in jail for a long time. In fact, till somebody else gets him to be in control. Anyway, that's chapter 9 of Be Daring. Well, I hope that was okay. I'm sorry I struggled a little with my speaking, but let me turn off the screen share so we can share with each other about the lesson. Okay. Are we sharing now? Are you seeing the full screen?
Yeah, it still has the sharing up.
Oh, I see what I've done. No, I don't want to share that. Let's see. Click the wrong button. Boy, I'm on top of things today.
There we go.
There we go. All right. So Janet, how about you? What do you think?
No, I just in awe of Paul's dedication and how his faith did not waver. I think of myself, and if I'd had everybody against me like that, I would have probably knuckled under. And I just keeping God in the forefront and recognizing that God's on our side, and it doesn't matter what the world thinks, is such good protection that I forget that I have that on a regular basis.
I do too. I can logically work through it in my head, but emotionally, when the event happens, I'm just like, oh no, I got to fix it, or I got to do something, and I forget that the first step toward fixing a problem is to ask God how to fix it. I just go off and sometimes that's not the right answer.
May take a lifetime of practice to get into the routine of realizing, calling on God in every single moment.
Yeah. Guess it's part of praying continuously.
Mm-hmm.
And have God be your go-to person for every situation.
It just reminds me that that this whole life is practice. That this our whole existence on earth is practice to get us ready for heaven.
It is, isn't it? Yeah. It's a molding, I think of it. Each day God teach us a little more, makes that mold just a little bit better. An artist painting each day, you feel a little closer to completion. Yeah.
It's good.
And then some days you feel like somehow you spill paint all over the thing. You spilled you spilled the bottle of paint onto the tapestry or the canvas, and so you have to. But God turns it into something even more beautiful. Well, anything coming up this week for you guys? you folks?
I don't think so.
No,
Yeah.
no, we're doing good.
All right. Did you have a good 4th of July?
Yeah, it was pretty uneventful. We did go to our daughter that's in the area, and it's just for a short time. Janet needed to get back home. She'd promised the kids that she'd make them homemade pepperoni rolls for when they got home from their trip. So we had to visit short and come back home and start working on them. But it was a good time. It was just my daughter and her family, and our son-in-law's parents were there, and it was just a quiet time, but a good time.
Good.
Good. Well, this is a special day. This is Ida's birthday.
Mhm.
Oh, happy birthday!
Oh,
Yeah.
congratulations.
Yeah.
Looking forward to the day. We won't be doing too much, but just a family celebration,
Yeah.
which is plenty.
Good. How is your sister doing?
Mm. She's hanging in there, but just barely. They had a respite, they called it, for her husband this week. So he went to a facility where they had activities, and they took care of him for a day so she could have a day of doing catch-up work at home.
Uh-huh.
That's how they handle his illness every so often. And so
Yeah,
in the
she's
midst
got to
of
do
her-
everything for him. If he needs his nose scratched, she has to
Mhm.
scratch it.
Yeah.
Well, it was, we had a good time when we were there, though.
Mhm.
Yes,
We sure did,
sure did. They
with all of them, and hopefully we brought him some light, and
hopefully. We helped them do a lot of things. That felt good.
mhm,
And plant some plants and
flowers.
just to uplift their spirits and do things around the house. They had all these little plugs, smart plugs, so that he could speak. They have these little Alexa boxes all over the house, so he can talk, and he can say something like, turn on the TV fan, and it'll turn this fan on for him. Well, I helped him get those things working. He was
Good.
able to do that by the end, and
Mhm.
turn on this light and turn off that one.
He
So
can call Betty
he can call
when
Betty.
she's in a separate room,
Yeah,
can't hear him.
it's got an intercom thing. So that's
Right.
that's been a godsend. Those little
Mhm.
Alexa dots for them. They're able to.
Mhm.
He's able to, you know, do a lot.
Mhm.
He can write on the computer and he does. I watch him there, and uh, it's kind of frustrating using his computer because he's got it set up so that the little mouse follows his eyes. You know, it moves with his eyes. So when I'm
Mhm.
trying to help him, I'm using the mouse to move the cursor. But if I move my eyes, then it takes the mouse away from me and puts the little pointer somewhere else. And by the time I click, it's clicking on the wrong thing. It's like, oh, kind of funny there, but
That would be really good for him, though.
yeah, he's gotten the system down. Boy, he's amazing.
Yeah, and it would take a lot of the pressure off of his wife for him to be able to do some of those things, or for Alexa to be able to do them.
Yes, and he talks to his computer to when he needs some, like if he wants to go search for something on the internet. They just he can speak it, go
Mhm.
this. It's it really keeps his mind, I think, alive. It's really just
Mhm.
awesome.
Mhm.
Just I'm so thankful for that's technology's there
For him.
for him. Well, anyway, oh, we kept you late. I'm sorry, but
Not at all. Not at all.
we'll let you folks go, and we'll see you next week.
Okay.
Have a good week.
Yes, you all have a good
You
weekend.
too.
And
Okay.
hope the hurricane doesn't reach you.